I'll introduce the speakers one by one as it's their turn to speak, and of course we'll begin with Patty. Patty Zedler is an associate professor at Georgia State University's College of Law, where she writes on the regulation of medicine, biotech, and the FDA. Before coming to Georgia State, she was a fellow at Stanford Law School's Center for Law and the Biosciences, and also worked at the University of California at San Francisco's Program in Medical Ethics, the National Institutes of Health's Department of Bioethics. And perhaps most relevant to today's discussion, she served as an associate chief counsel in the FDA's Office of Chief Counsel. She's written a fascinating and informative paper for this conference on the FDA's gatekeeping role and non-therapeutic uses. It'll be available on our website, and I highly recommend it. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us, Adam, and for organizing this really interesting conference. Usually I go to health law and FDA-focused conferences, so I'm especially pleased to be here to have the opportunity to learn about some other areas of administrative gatekeeping. I am also, as a former staff attorney at FDA, particularly thrilled to have the opportunity to be on a panel with two former chief counsels that Adam hasn't introduced yet, and also, frankly, a little intimidated. So I'm looking forward to it. So our panel focuses on FDA's gatekeeping role for drugs and devices. New drugs and many devices cannot be marketed in the United States until and unless FDA reviews them and authorizes their marketing. Although the precise standards for FDA authorization differ quite a bit for new drugs and devices, the overall gist is the same. The agency is charged with assessing the safety and effectiveness of the products. And because no drug or device can be perfectly safe, when FDA decides that a product is safe and effective, it's deciding that its benefits outweigh its risks. And because the benefits and risks of a product might depend on its particular use, so we might think a risk of death is okay for a prescription drug intended for a terminal illness, but not for an over-the-counter medicine for minor aches and pains. FDA's determination is actually a determination that a particular use of a product has a favorable benefit-risk ratio. So my project, as Adam mentioned, looks specifically at how the agency has exercised and can exercise this gatekeeping authority over non-therapeutic uses of drugs and devices. So what do I mean by that? This can include aesthetic uses, such as drugs for normal male hair loss or dermal fillers that plump up the face, or perhaps most famously and quite lucratively, Botox for facial wrinkles. It could also include performance-enhancing uses. So there are devices, brain stimulation devices that are marketed for cognitive or athletic performance enhancement rather than disease treatment, and even recreational uses of drugs and devices. The key being that these are uses that are not health-related and not for a clinical purpose. So I'm going to briefly touch on three questions today, which is first, why should we care about how FDA reviews non-therapeutic uses, or maybe put differently, what in the world is FDA doing in this space? Second, what do we know about how FDA assesses safety and effectiveness in this area? And third, how should we think about what FDA is doing, about FDA's approach? So why might we care about how FDA reviews non-therapeutic uses of drugs and devices? One reason is simply that Congress has charged FDA with regulating at least some non-therapeutic uses. The scope of FDA's drug and device jurisdiction is quite broad. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act defines drugs and devices as things that are intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent disease, or intended to affect the structure or function of the body. And it's that second prong of the definition that allows FDA to reach many non-therapeutic uses. So eliminating frown lines on our face doesn't address disease at all, but it does affect the structure or function of the body. Of course, there are a number of carve-outs to the drug and device definitions for certain products with structure, function, or similar uses, including dietary supplements and cosmetics. And I'm happy to talk more about my views on the exact parameters of the drug and device device definitions in the discussion, particularly because I'm personally interested to hear Becky and Dan's thoughts. But for now, I'll simply say that the statutory language suggests FDA's drug and device jurisdiction is broader than simply those products that are used as therapies. And in many emerging technology spaces, this is something that's misunderstood. And in that same space, there's a lot of concern about being subject to FDA regulations. There are efforts to market products in ways that escape the drug and device definitions. At the same time that FDA has this broad jurisdiction, debates about whether FDA is appropriately implementing its pre-market review authorities tend to focus, I think understandably, on the other end of the spectrum of what FDA regulates, on therapies for seriously and terminally ill patients. But there's a lot of hope right now for certain non-therapeutic technologies, including performance-enhancing technologies. So it's important to understand what FDA is and can do. And I think, as David mentioned on the last panel, I also think it's sort of non-therapeutic uses are an interesting way to think about the government's role in licensing or approvals, because it's not quite what we intuitively think of as FDA doing. So what do we know about how FDA assesses non-therapeutic uses? I'll mention a few observations. I think it's worth noting that the history of FDA authorizations here primarily focuses on aesthetic uses of products, like the Botoxes of the world. So to the extent we see companies wanting to market other kinds of non-therapeutic uses of technologies, like performance-enhancing ones, there may be questions about how helpful the regulatory history is for predicting the path forward for those uses. Second, in many or some instances, just as in the therapeutic context, FDA exercises its discretion not to enforce its gatekeeping authority. So it might do this somewhat formally through guidance or some other means, or it might simply not take action if a company is marketing a non-therapeutic use without the agency's authorization. Finally, when it does enforce requirements for FDA authorization, the agency does not seem to require exceptionally low risks or exceptionally large benefits for those non-therapeutic uses. We might logically think it's difficult to get FDA authorization for a non-therapeutic use because such uses are intrinsically or inherently less valuable than therapeutic ones. Meaning that the non-therapeutic benefit must be quite large or the risk quite low in order to have a favorable benefit-risk ratio. But it's not obvious that this is how the regulatory history has played out. FDA has been willing to authorize non-therapeutic uses associated with some relatively small benefits or some large risks. So Botox and dermal fillers are both associated with a risk of death, albeit rare. But that being said, FDA does seem to weigh non-therapeutic uses a little bit differently than therapeutic ones. Perhaps the most clear example is the history of silicone breast implants, which were only permitted for reconstructive and not purely aesthetic uses for a number of years. And because we're talking about the same product in the same procedure, it follows that the agency put a different value on the reconstructive versus the aesthetic benefit. So the regulatory history suggests that FDA does weigh the benefits slightly differently, although perhaps not as differently as we might expect or might worry. So finally, how should we think about this approach? So it might strike fear into some of our hearts that FDA could reach non-medical technologies or non-medical uses of technologies, but I'm not entirely sure such fear would be warranted. FDA and scholars have identified a number of different purposes that FDA gatekeeping for drugs and devices serves, and I'll talk just about two today. And I think considering these purposes, it's possible that non-therapeutic uses of technologies are well served by FDA having a gatekeeping role here. So one of the purposes of FDA gatekeeping is, of course, consumer protection. FDA protects consumers from unsafe and ineffective drugs and devices. And as I said, we might think FDA would be obligated to take a fairly restrictive approach under its consumer protection role. And moreover, many of the arguments against FDA gatekeeping that are rooted in terminally ill patients' liberty interests in accessing therapies for their illness don't hold the same maybe less persuasive in the non-therapeutic context. So we don't hear people talking about a right to try Botox, right? But as I noted, it's not clear that the path that FDA has chosen is one that is overly restrictive, and the agency does have a fair amount of flexibility under the law and its regulations as to as to the standard it applies to its gatekeeping decisions. And indeed, we might conceive of FDA's consumer protection role differently if we view consumers of non-therapeutic uses differently than patients who need therapies. So in some respects, patients are forced by their illness to take a drug or device that treats their illness, and the healthcare system, and payers in particular, are forced to pay for them. For non-therapeutic uses, consumers, although they may have some intersection with the healthcare system by getting a prescription from a physician, nevertheless can freely elect to use the products or not, assuming we're talking about a non-addictive product. So a second purpose of FDA gatekeeping, and I think to some its most important purpose, is an information production role. So by requiring companies to produce robust evidence about the effects of their products, information is produced that otherwise would not be in the absence of FDA gatekeeping. So we may not, in some respects, we may think we don't care that much about incentivizing information about non-therapeutic uses, so maybe we don't care about understanding the latest and greatest wrinkle-eliminating technology, although perhaps my tune on that will change as I continue to age. But FDA's information production role for non-therapeutic uses could be important for other reasons. For performance-enhancing uses, there are supporters of cognitive enhancement and other technologies that are quite hopeful about where those technologies could take us, and it would be critical to have rigorous information about the technologies to understand whether their potential has been realized or to help us realize that potential. Likewise, even with recreational uses, humans have long used drugs for recreational purposes. I don't think that will stop anytime soon. And if we had a safe and non-addictive recreational product, that could actually be a huge public health benefit, right? And the sort of bigger point there is that even if a non-therapeutic use does not have a health benefit or an unacceptable health risk to an individual user, there might be widespread societal reasons or societal effects on the risk or benefit side that FDA gatekeeping could help us understand in that space by solving this informational problem. So I'll wrap up there and just say, although FDA's authority in this area at first blush might seem counterintuitive and even a bit concerning, considering the purposes of FDA gatekeeping suggests that FDA has a lot of flexibility in how it implements its role in this space and could potentially play an important role in incentivizing information and innovation with these technologies.
Okay, our second speaker in this panel is Rebecca Wood. Becky served as the FDA's chief counsel from 2017 to 2018 under FDA Administrator Scott Gottlieb. She's now co-leader of Sidley Austin's Food, Drug, and Medical Device Regulatory Practice. She's had a long career of counseling FDA-regulated entities in major litigation. Earlier in her career, she served as a law clerk to Judge Pascal Bowman on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. Becky, welcome.
Oh, thanks, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Professor Zettler, for such an interesting, thought-provoking paper. Since I've just gotten out of the agency about 5 minutes ago, I will start with a little bit of a public service announcement, which is I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not speaking on behalf of the agency, obviously, or clients. And there may be some specific issues I just won't be able to get into if they were under me while I was at the agency. I guess a couple of observations that I will start with. I mean, fundamentally, this is a conference about the concept of administrative law and gatekeeping, right? And when should FDA exercise its jurisdiction? I think one thing that has struck me a great deal is that FDA very jealously guards its jurisdiction for many good reasons. And FDA tends to be an agency that has a great reservoir of plain statutory authorization to do many, many things It regulates upwards of 25% of the US economy right now. There's certainly some in government right now saying we're trying to reduce that to 20% or 15%. But the fact remains that there is this great reservoir of jurisdiction. And on the one hand, I think there are great currents within FDA that say we are very reluctant to ever say we don't have jurisdiction. There certainly have been circumstances where there has been perhaps an attitude of we would rather win by losing. We would rather take a position that we have more jurisdiction than even our extraordinarily broad statute may support. I mean, obviously, the tobacco litigation of some years ago is the probably quintessential example of that, where FDA, for policy reasons, some administrations ago, decided that it would assert authority over cigarettes and traditional tobacco products. They were ultimately smacked down by the courts. What did Congress do? It gave FDA that authority. So in some sense, that could be viewed as a, quote, victory for FDA asserting its jurisdiction, a very controversial and important question. I think FDA is in part jealous of its jurisdiction because there's a sense in which it's sometimes the last bulwark against really bad things. For example, there could be things coming in at the border where in time, DEA may have jurisdiction and authority to regulate them, but in the first instance, FDA may, based on its extremely broad statutory authority, have the most logical place to start. So I think it's rare that you will ever see FDA, going out of its way to tell you it doesn't have jurisdiction over something. I think, however, the therapeutics area is a really interesting one. And there is, of course, right now a giant debate going on, and I won't speak about the matters that are currently under deliberation at the agency, but a giant debate about the notion of claims. And do you decide if something should be regulated as a drug or a device based on objective claims that are within the company's control? This is going to be used for the following. And if the following fits squarely within the definition because it's treating a disease, then under that theory of a claims-based notion of regulation, it should be regulated. If that's the case and you're following that approach, then whether something is going to be regulated as a drug or device or not really should turn on that fundamental legal question. And in theory, at least, if this theory holds, a manufacturer has a great deal of control if they're carefully crafting the claims that they're making about their product to decide which side of the line they're going to be on. Do they, on the one hand, want to be making claims, be regulated as a drug and device, or do they not? And this, of course, feeds into a giant ongoing debate about the intersection of that whole regime and the First Amendment. Because historically, FDA garnered a lot of power by saying to companies, we have a monopoly over whether you can say certain things publicly. And in order to do that, you have to come into the system and you have to let us, as the expert agency, approve whether you can say X, Y, Z. And so there's an advantage to going to the system because you then get a monopoly in the market to say X, Y, Z that we've approved. Enter the First Amendment revolution in the courts, the Sorrell case from the Supreme Court from a number of years ago, the Caronia case from the Second Circuit. Note that it was the dissent in Caronia that said, this is going to upend how FDA regulates because what's the incentive to go into the system and do all the extra work to become a drug or device if you can say whatever you want if it's truthful and non-misleading? That was the dissent. There was cert petition was not filed by the then government, and that's the law in the Second Circuit. So there have been a lot of movement in the courts to recognize the high value of truthful, non-misleading speech with respect to claims. So I think one of the really interesting questions in terms of FDA as a gatekeeper that folks will need to continue to struggle with is when does it get to be the gatekeeper or not? And to turn to kind of the 2 points that the professor put on the table, consumer protection and information production role, I think a key question is really who, if you're creating a system, who is best equipped to try to encourage those laudable goals? Should FDA be doing that? Of course, FDA has certain mandates to do things that have the effect of important consumer protection and information production. But if you're looking simply at whether a product falls on one side or the other of the agency having jurisdiction to regulate, you might also consider whether those goals, as laudable as they are, could be accomplished elsewhere. So, for example, I spent a lot of my time as a tort lawyer defending companies in tort, and there is certainly a very active plaintiffs' bar in this country that does not hesitate to bring class actions, to get their state attorneys general involved. So there are other ways, if you feel that a company is saying something misleading, to get at that allegedly bad behavior. You can bring a private action, you can ask for a fraud action to be brought by your state attorney general or by the Department of Justice. There's other ways to do that potentially. And if you're worried about information production and having good quality information, I think it hits right at the heart of this really important debate about if what we're talking about is good quality information, if it's truthful and non-misleading, it should be protected by the First Amendment. Do you need the government to regulate that or not? And how do you need the government to regulate that right now? So I think you've put your finger on a number of very, very important crossroads that the agency and folks that are practicing in this area and companies are trying to navigate as they try to get out good information, and as they have kind of the fear of tort actions and securities actions to also help kind of hem in behavior. I will say, just to kind of give a sense, I think there is a great moment right now. The agency very self-consciously talks about being at an inflection point where science is just bursting forward, where innovation is bursting forward. 21st Century Cure, which came a couple of years ago, was Congress really giving enormous additional authorities to the agency to be, sort of ramped up in how it regulates across its portfolio of cases. And so I think there's a lot of interest in the agency right now in how it regulates. But, can we just carve out these non-therapeutic uses by adhering to a better definition of the jurisdiction in the first place? And I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Great, thank you very much. So our third and final speaker is Daniel Troy. He served as the FDA's chief counsel from 2001 to 2004. More recently, from 2008 to 2018, he was senior vice president and general counsel of GlaxoSmithKline. Before that, he was a partner at Sidley Austin. I know we're having a very Sidley Austin day today, also with James Coleman. Dan previously clerked for Judge Robert Bork on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and served in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. And he chaired the American Bar Association's Administrative Law Section from 2006 to 2007. Dan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's great to have the opportunity to see Becky, who I haven't seen for a long time, and thank you, Professor, for a very interesting, worthwhile, well-researched, well-written article that involved, for me, a little bit of a walk down memory lane. We are here at the Scalia Law School, so I think it behooves us to at least sort of go back to first principles and to ask the question at a session on permitting, should we really have a government gatekeeper to the kinds of products that FDA regulates? And actually, Charles Murray, in What It Means to Be a Libertarian, argues that you could envision a system of private certifying entities and, as Becky alluded to, tort liability. Well, despite my sort of, I'd say, some libertarian leanings, especially as I was younger, I just don't think that that really works. And I do believe in FDA. I do think we need an FDA. Well, why? Well, libertarian theory kind of breaks down when people can't evaluate or exercise free choice. And in this space, actually, patients/consumers don't really know enough to be able to make the decisions for themselves. In fact, doctors make the decisions for them. It would be akin to the libertarian justification for banning addictive drugs is that once somebody gets addicted to a drug, they're not really exercising their free will or their consent. It's also why libertarian theory doesn't really apply to marketing to children, because children presumably can't exercise their own free will of consent. But I think the more pragmatic reason, and as one gets older, I think one's libertarianism gets very much balanced out with pragmatism, at least mine has. It is significant to me that no government in the world does it that way, right? And why? It's because the public just expects certain protections from the government. So, maybe be like, libertarianism, like they say, socialism has never really been tried, pure libertarianism has never been tried. There are probably reasons for that. So we do need an FDA. Now, FDA may, on occasion, particularly in my view, go too far, but I think the reactions to the crises actually show that we do need an FDA. And what do I mean by that? Almost always, when there's some kind of outbreak, melamine or you pick it, Congress comes in and gives the FDA more authority, or at least more resources, because there is an expectation, a societal expectation, that someone, the government, is going to be protecting us from some of these products that could do us some grave harm. So so the paper really addresses the question, does FDA get the balance right in choosing what to regulate and what not to regulate, particularly for things that are really on the periphery of what was historically the concerns that led to the FDA, i.e. Non-therapeutic uses. So I think this has already been explained, but I explained it much more simplistically because I'm very simple. The basis for FDA's jurisdiction when you talk about the structure and function is words. Okay, let me give you an example. FDA does not regulate this pen. However, if I said, if you use this pen, it will cure your cancer, boom, FDA regulates it. Why? Because I've used the words, they're the magic words that invoke FDA's jurisdiction over the pen, even though FDA does not regulate the pen. But there are some, and Becky alluded to them, there's some at the agency who just take the FDA's statute completely literally. So what do they, so the statute says intended to affect the structure and function of the body of man or animal. These days I think it would be written as body of a human or animal. And their view is, well, this chair is affecting the structure and function of my body right now. It is preventing me from falling on the floor. And so I have been in conversations with people, senior people at the chief counsel's office, who said, basically we regulate everything that touches this, we could regulate everything that touches the structure and function of the human body. A catcher's mitt, right, prevents you from hurting your hand. Exercise equipment certainly is marketed in order to affect the structure and function, but we actually don't do it by dint of our enforcement discretion. Okay, so we allow the Consumer Product Safety Commission to exist. I think that is a deeply flawed view. Okay, first of all, there is a CPSC, and it can't be that when FDA was created in 1938, whenever it was, given its modern powers in 1938, that Congress thought that it was giving the FDA the authority to regulate catcher's mitts. I mean, now the statute has been amended many times before, but I don't think, you guys know better than I do, the structure function definition has been amended since that time. So again, we have to find an answer between everything and nothing, and the place where we look is intended use. And there's the traditional view for food and drug lawyers is of objective intent, but there have been efforts, tobacco is one of them, to look at subjective evidence. But that's really a huge problem. It's really a problem, and I know the agency is struggling with this now as it proposed a rule, then it pulled it back, and the problem is this. I'll take GSK, although I'm very clear, I'm not speaking by or on behalf of GSK, I'm speaking in my personal capacity. GSK traditionally has marketed a product called Loveza. Loveza is basically omega-3 fatty acids, but approved only for people with very high triglycerides. GSK knows that a large amount of the use is not just for people who are for very high triglycerides. So we market it with knowing that off-label use is out there. We never promoted it, never lifted a finger to promote it, but we know to a moral certainty that there is an amount of off-label use. If you say that the subjective intent of marketing the product, knowing that people are using it off-label, is somehow running afoul of FDA, then you're essentially either banning off-label use, which is a big problem, or you're saying every company is always criminal unless they put in place their own voluntary program to essentially ban off-label use, which would substantially inhibit the practice of medicine. So it's a problem. And this was litigated and thrashed out. My introduction to food and drug law was working on the tobacco case for Brown and Williamson. And what I'd say about the tobacco case is I think the court got it right. And I'm not that troubled that Congress came along later and gave FDA the authority over tobacco. At least it was a democratic outcome, right? The system worked the way it should work, rather than an administrative agency changing a position that it had taken for 50 or 75 years and all of a sudden regulating this very, very, very substantial, very controversial industry. So I think that was, again, I think that's sort of the right outcome. So the professor's paper touches on some issues that came up at my time at FDA. I'm not going to go into them, but Botox cosmetic has already been alluded to. I will say that Botox started out as a therapeutic product. Then Sieber made the company use the words Botox Cosmetic for the cosmetic use. I don't think you know this story, but when it came to OCC the night before it was supposed to be signed off, someone at OCC said, oh, it's misleading to use the word cosmetic because it's a biologic. Let's just have them change every package and just strike the word cosmetic. I'm like, we told them to put the word cosmetic on. It is for a cosmetic use of a biologic. And you think they can really change the trademark and change the packaging on eve of launch? That was quite interesting.
You could put stickers over it.
Yeah, we talked about, cosmetic contact lenses, which I think the paper starts out with Verichip, which was a chip that would be embedded in the structure and function of a person. This started actually in veterinary uses, so that people can keep track of their dogs and cats, but there was a proposal to use it either for identification information or for help for public, to carry your health records around in it. FDA, we sent a letter in which we said, well, FDA doesn't regulate the information security part of it, does regulate the health claims part of it. Just this week, some of you may listen to NPR, there was a story about how in Sweden now, thousands of millennials have gotten essentially a Verichip, although now it's a tiny little, basically smaller than a grain of rice. You put it in your finger, and it is used to get in your house. It's used to convey information to your friend who has a smartphone. It's used to pay. So everything that's old is new again. One of the areas there that FDA has, I think, really challenged innovation that touches on this area is transgenic salmon. This is a normal salmon where you insert a gene into it and it grows at a much faster rate. That product has been pending in front of FDA for 20 years and it has not really been available. So when FDA gets to the outer edges of its jurisdiction, it can be problematic. One of the things that I think we did when I was there, was we pushed out a glowfish. This was a genetically changed fish that glowed, and yet people were outraged that we allowed this. This is where I think, again, on the margins, FDA can really almost be silly. And their problem with using enforcement discretion is that it doesn't really provide predictability. It doesn't really provide certainty. There's a lot of I know it when I see it. As Becky alluded to, the agency almost never wants to say no. I think Scott and in 21st Century Cures, there have been some laudable exceptions for software. At least for years, it was reputed that Apple and Google were staying away from the healthcare space because they were so afraid of falling within FDA's jurisdiction. That shows you that FDA can, and in the past has been, and again, I think Scott's doing a great job to try and address this, be very much of a brake on innovation. And the agency, in my experience, often wants to retain flexibility because who knows what might happen. And hard cases can make bad law. The agency does, I think, seek to preserve its flexibility. The other problem with enforcement discretion is it does raise other risks. You can, basically you need to consciously make a decision unless the FDA has said that it's exercising its enforcement discretion, which it sometimes does. You're still presumably marketing something that could be subject to product liability, to the attorneys general, that, taking a decision inside a company to do something that is illegal, but that this current administration has said they're not going to enforce the law about it, that's not a very comfortable place to be, honestly. So I do think that the article shows that by and large, FDA has muddled through. I will note that FDA has often muddled through with sub-regulatory guidance, and that this is a whole nother administrative law subject, is going to likely get less deference with 5 Madisonians on the Supreme Court. Many predict that what's called Auer or Seminole Rock deference is going to go by the wayside, and many even question whether Chevron deference will go by the wayside, and it really does remain to be seen how FDA will respond. It would be great to see more rulemaking, because that does give an opportunity for public participation and stability. But given the perception of ossification, or maybe the reality of ossification, not just on rules, but now, at least I've heard a rumor, Becky may confirm or not, that the agency is even and this was started to be true even when I was there, the FDA even thinks that guidance is too slow, right? So, you're talking about operating by sub-regulatory guidance that A, isn't really going to get much deference, and B, could be changed very quickly by a subsequent administration. So I do think that the FDA, and Patty makes this point, does look at what the public might think. I think they try and want to kind of get it right. They're trying to gauge common sense. But occasionally, again, as I mentioned, I think they can go too far. Personally, the idea that aesthetic breast implants were not allowed to be marketed in the United States until 2006. I mean, I'm not going to go on a crusade for aesthetic breast implants, but that seems to me to be pretty darn paternalistic. Transgenic salmon, 20 years. So, we've gone a long way, I have even in this conversation, from the need for government regulation to preserve life-saving products to banning breast implants for aesthetic reasons. So the question is there a better, more stable, more coherent approach? And I think the paper really does help us very much understand the past and the present. I hope that you will turn your attention to the future as well. But as you do, I would urge skepticism around the only point that you make that I might take issue with, and that is whether FDA regulation would foster innovation in the enhancement or recreational space. So what you said was it incentivizes information production. Well, let's be very clear. The way it incentivizes information production is by banning you from doing it until you produce the information. Okay? So that's a powerful incentive. It's a very powerful incentive, but it is basically the government forcing you to develop the information. And given the speed or lack of government and the pace of the private sector change, at least my bias is for the government and the FDA to try and get out of the way to the extent possible. And again, I think that some of the moves that the FDA has recently made on software are very, very welcome, but I think that we're a long time in coming. So the real question is that the paper poses for me, and I don't have the answer to this, is there a better way? But with that, I really thank you for the paper. I thank you for the invitation, and really was a fun and fascinating way to spend some time.
Great, thank you, Dan. Now, Becky Dan talked about rumors about guidance and so on. I'll just be clear, we encourage all of our panelists to confirm all sorts of rumors, so feel free. But Patty, why don't we begin with you and give you an opportunity to sort of respond to anything you've heard, and then Becky as well, if you have any thoughts on Dan's talk, please.
Well, I'll just reiterate my thanks. Your perspectives are very interesting and informative, and I know will help me as I revise the paper going forward. But I'll leave time for others' questions.
Becky, did you have any thoughts in response to Dan?
Yeah, I'm not rumor mongering, but I can talk a little bit about guidance practices. So I was one of those people before I went into the agency who was profoundly skeptical of guidance. I think I even sat on a panel and said, why can't the agency just do proper rulemaking? Why can't we have real statutes and real regs? And why do we have to listen to speeches to figure out what the agency's doing? I'm a litigator. I'm not citing this sub-regulatory stuff. It's not real law. Let's have real law. I will say it looks very different in the agency. And my husband might accuse me of having been regulatorily captured. I don't think I was. But, let me just say this. I think there is a lot of discussion now about the role of guidance documents in government, the potential way in which it, avoids the democratic process, in which it avoids what some would view as proper rulemaking. What you may not know is that FDA is somewhat uniquely situated within government in that it has statutory and regulatory authority for the way in which it issues its guidance. Literally, it's very different than anybody else. And that was in part in response to a view some years ago that FDA was engaging in podium policy, that only a very select members of, if this view is correct, only if a select numbers of the sort of inner sanctum FDA bar who went to certain conferences, who heard certain folks within the agency say things at conferences, had the real view of how the agency was actually going to behave. And there was a sense in which that's not good rule of law. And so there came these good guidance practices, and the purpose of them, and OCC takes it very seriously, I think the agency takes it very seriously in how they review guidance documents, is to make sure that they are in fact not binding when they're meant to be non-binding. And you can have your own judgment about how successful the agency is in living up to that ideal. But I think there really is a sense in which it's not just boilerplate to say it's not binding, but how can you make them in fact not binding if they're not meant to be? There's an asterisk here. There are occasions where Congress actually instructs the agency to issue guidance on certain things, so it has kind of its own legal position. But with respect to sort of the run of guidance documents, here's the reality. You have statutory authority, you have regulations, and you have companies calling into the agency constantly, asking questions, and people are giving answers to them. Should we do this or this when we're submitting our application? They get an opinion. So there's all these micro opinions happening. And so one justification that people often put forward for having a real guidance program is all of those answers should find their way into a public document so that there is transparency, so that there's a level playing field. So if your company happens to get that answer, you're not getting different information than your colleagues in the market. So there's fairness and shared information. So that's one justification that I think people will often put forward for a good of guidance. And the idea is basically, if a regulation tells you you can do something, technology may be moving so quickly that you can't possibly understand all of the iterations of it. It's much easier to do that in a guidance document that you can get out quickly. And most of FDA's guidance documents are subject to comment periods, and they are adjusted in response to comments. And so I think there is, at least in place, a very different system for oversight internally of FDA on guidance documents that I think is somewhat differently situated than many of the other agencies. How successful FDA is in implementing that, people can judge for themselves.
No, it's fascinating. I didn't know that about the FDA and its sort of unique, responsibilities regarding guidance. The way you describe it, it almost sounds like, 20 years ago when the SEC issued, I think they call it Reg FD for full disclosure, right, to help the market make sure that everybody had equal information. You were going to say something, Dan?
So I called good guidance practices essentially, the original understanding of the notice and comment rulemaking, right? So the problem isn't really notice and comment rulemaking. Peter Putt made this point the other day. But the problem is everything that's been layered on top of notice and comment rulemaking. I mean, FDA, when it does subscribe to good guidance practices, is essentially engaging in what notice and comment rulemaking used to be before. You had to put in a cost-benefit analysis and a paperwork statement and all these other things. So I mean, the rumor I was asking you to confirm, or the attitude is that people at this point are reluctant even to do guidance because they think that's so burdensome, and it does take time because, as you say, FDA with its good guidance practices does go through 2 stages, does put it out for notice and comment, does take comments, does issue a final. It really looks a lot like what notice and comment rulemaking looked like a long time ago. I will note that towards the end of the Bush 43 administration, OMB put out something that I think there's talk about potentially bringing back, which is requiring other agencies to go through the type of good guidance practices that FDA does. So, it's one thing for FDA, at least again, puts it out, notice and comment, brings it back.
And the way, right, and I think
EPA, it's out there and boom, it's done.
And I think the argument for why good guidance practice issued guidances are not regulations is that they're truly guidance, they're not binding, what that means is you don't have to do it this way. This is one lawful path, this is the argument goes, to do something in a way that the agency will find appropriate. You can also point to a different path. Now, the critics will say, yeah, but you're really creating a de facto rule. So that's a big debate right now.
So every single change I made at the agency was completely eradicated by subsequent administrations, except before 2002, FDA guidances did not say at the top contains 9 binding recommendations. I made them put that in there because I was aware of the case law, like Alaska Power and all these other cases, which say guidance cannot be binding. So that's when we put that in there. It's the only thing that survived, plus that first paragraph, which says there's another way to comply. You can, interact with the agency about it.
And the document should not just say that, but it should be that, right? I mean,
It has to be applied
you have
that
to
way.
vet
You
the
have to
whole
walk the
thing.
walk
Yeah,
and talk the
that's
talk.
exactly right.
Betty?
Oh, I was just going to say, there are actually a few statutory provisions that allow FDA to issue binding guidance. So, and I reviewed some of them at the agency, so I'd have to tinker with the language you added to the guidance
And
statutes.
that is accounted
You
for,
know?
right? That's
Yeah.
the asterisk.
Yeah.
Right,
Exactly
right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the guidance issue, obviously, it's one that's been close to the interests of the center. We've had discussions on this ourselves. If you're interested, I highly recommend, among other things, Nick Perillo of Yale did a great report on, for the Administrative Conference of the United States, on how agencies see guidance and how the regulated community sees guidance and how much it varies from industry to industry. And so, but I want to actually just stick with the guidance issue for one more moment and just bring it back to the overarching sort of theme of the session today, right? When we're looking at agencies in their capacity as gatekeepers, right? I mean, obviously, it's always often in conjunction with the regulatory powers and other things, but thinking of them as gatekeepers and in a position, it gives them unique sort of power or leverage, however you want to say it, right? They're better able to force information from the regulated community because they're the gatekeeper. I'm just curious, now that we've delved into it, does guidance take on extra weight in a context where it's a gatekeeper agency, or do you think that guidance is sort of guidance across all agencies? I mean, not to put you on the spot, but I mean, Patty, can I put you on the spot? I mean, how do you think about these things?
So, I mean, I think one criticism I hear of FDA using guidance is that FDA is so powerful over the agencies it regulates that, of course, industry is going to follow what FDA says, even if it is non-binding, even if the agency legitimately, behind closed doors is willing to entertain other paths forward. FDA has so much power that why would you do anything other than what FDA has publicly said is the path forward? But in reality, I imagine it probably depends a little bit on the guidance, whether it's if it's a guidance about how to design your clinical trials to show that your antibiotic is non-inferior to other antibiotics on the market. So, and that's the path, that's the way to get FDA approval to market your antibiotic. Yeah, that probably has a really big, it probably is a very important, but it might, but other guidances might not depend so much on FDA's gatekeeping powers.
I mean, one observation
Yeah.
is just in the gatekeeping function, there may be a series of highly technical questions about how you if you've decided you are a drug, for example, there may be a series of highly technical questions about how you submit a successful application. And so to the extent that the guidance document can give some pathways and some certainty around here is a path or here are several paths that we would find acceptable. Sometimes regulated industry wants an answer. They want to know that what they're doing is going to be acceptable, and so that certainty can actually help innovation move through more efficiently, properly cabined. But you're exactly right. I think a criticism on the other side would be, does that sort of drown out other pathways?
Yeah, I mean, I could say from the perspective of being an agency guidance in the gatekeeper function, in the clinical trial context, for example, it's a de facto rule. I mean, only if you really cannot, comply with it, right? For some technical reason, some ethical reason, if you really, really, really think that, you've got a powerful scientific argument that you can win with the agency, but, the cost of actually trying to engage with the agency to get them to move off their guidance is rarely worth it. You'll only do it if you have absolutely no choice. So they do function as de facto rules.
And I could see how guidance, even if it's non-binding for purposes of the agency, it might play a role later in tort lawsuits regarding the regulated product. Well, moving on to a slightly different subject, getting back to Professor Zettler's focus on the distinction between therapeutic and non-therapeutic. I'm just curious, given everything the FDA's experienced in the last couple of decades with this expansion of non-therapeutic uses, at least that's how I understand the history of it, has the FDA learned more, has it reconceived its approach to therapeutic uses based on what it's done with non-therapeutic uses? I mean, as it starts to think more and more in terms of, well, non-therapeutic is different, so we should go this way, has that affected its approach to therapeutic uses? It's kind of a nebulous question, but I'm just curious.
I don't know if that's the case. I mean, I will say that I think among FDA leadership, and you can hear this in the speeches they make, you can see this in how they present major new policy announcements, I think FDA sees itself very self-consciously right now as being a risk-based organization, that it is very self-consciously trying to focus on in approvals and in what it prioritizes, what poses the most risk in its enforcement actions. And so, perhaps that helps explain in part how a therapeutic use would be evaluated. But I think that is sort of a resounding theme that you see, and it would vary from center to center given their different authorities and given the different policy preferences involved in it. There's also certainly, I think, a big movement to deal with personalized medicine, to deal with right to try, compassionate use, and a sense that individual patient preference really matters. I take your point that if you're looking at it from a risk-based approach, the person who has Duchenne's disease or ALS and has a very limited life expectancy may have, on average, a more compelling case to try stuff that could have really bad side effects. But, I think there's also a sense in which there ought to be some autonomy of the person. And, who's to say somebody's cosmetic use may be somebody else's painful embarrassment to go out, and some respect for the autonomy of the individual and differences about what they find important.
So I'm not sure that the non-therapeutic use debate has influenced the way the FDA thinks about therapeutic use. I have always thought that the problem that FDA has, and I think it tries to deal with it, is that the drug statute is just too one-size-fits-all, right? If once you're a drug, you got the full weight of what the FDA drug approval process. I was always much more a fan of the device amendments, which are of course way more modern. They're 76 rather than 38, because they are risk-based and there's a sliding scale, and you can actually, and that it makes sense because medical devices are everything from literally Q-tips and toothbrushes to pacemakers. But and I think FDA has struggled to try and bring some of that kind of a more sliding scale approach into the drug space when the statute and the regs don't really directly admit of it. And again, I think FDA's muddled through, and it's doing right now very, as well as it's done in a very, 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 very long time. But it would be great if there were some opportunity to really rethink fundamentally whether, and this is why the fight about whether something fits into the drug box or not which is touched on by the paper, is so salient, because once it's a drug, it can be Katie bar the door.
And that's why I think there's talk about, should we dust off a cosmetic statute? I mean, there's been talk for decades about should we modernize the whole statutory framework. I mean, as you point out in your paper, there's no such thing as a non-therapeutic use. There's no such thing as a cosmeceutical, but there kind of are in reality. And so should Congress step in, again, good luck with that, and make a more coherent statutory scheme?
My understanding
Maybe
also is
that's
that
the
there's also, I think that someone told me there's an OTC bill also
There is, yeah.
sort of being discussed pretty seriously on the Hill.
Well, we'll go to audience questions in just a moment, but I just ask, Professor, if you were, now with everything you've been writing on, if you could be Congress for a day and amend these statutes, what would be the first thing that you would change?
That's a really good question that I've never envisioned myself being Congress, all of Congress, all at once.
You could propose a bill in your revised statute.
Yeah, but so something that I think is actually somewhat related to the power of the sort of idea that once you're a drug, and FDA has all this authority over you, is that in the past year or so, I've been doing some work talking with biohackers who are sort of individuals that do do-it-yourself gene therapies or do-it-yourself implants of various, for various reasons, and a lot of these kinds of non-therapeutic uses. A guy injected himself with the same jellyfish protein that made the glowfish, to try to make his own skin glow.
Did it work?
No, I don't think so. But I wish there were a way for communities like that are doing interesting, sort of innovative things that have a sort of very specific social or sort of very specific view on science to engage with FDA and talk with the agency about the effects of the agency's position and what they're actually doing and how it fits with what FDA sees without sort of outing themselves to FDA and opening themselves up to enforcement. So there is notice and comment rulemaking. There is the opportunity to comment on guidance and other things, but if you do that, you're alerting the agency to the fact that maybe what you're doing is distributing an unapproved drug, and then you're bringing the full weight of FDA down on you. So there's this sort of barrier to actually engaging with the agency.
Honestly, there's so much in common between that situation and the fintech sort of situation right now that it's not an accident that we had both these panels together in the afternoon, because they just seem to me at least to have a lot of that in common, this sort of uneasy relationship between, this subset of innovators from outside of the regular community and these gatekeepers, whether it's the FDA or the OCC and so on. So, well, everybody's been very patient. If there are any questions in the audience, by all means, please raise your hand and a microphone will find you. We'll start right here, Mackenzie.
This is for anyone, but specifically, Ms. Wood, you mentioned how Congress gave the FDA authority over tobacco marketing over years of infighting. My understanding is that one part of the Tobacco Control Act was a mandate that the FDA partner with the FTC, at least to the marketing aspects of those products. So, as we've talked about technological advancements with all sorts of devices that go through FDA approval process, I was sort of wondering what your thoughts on what that partnership should look like and whether that sort of interagency or partnership should be expanded to other agencies, specifically to try to broadly combine the FDA's expertise in the health products with the FTC's expertise in preventing deceptive marketing practices, as well as with the technological advancements, right? They've sort of been the Federal Technology Commission for a while. And I just wonder if that sort of partnership where a device may be changed or updated after already being approved, and the parts that actually affect the human body don't really change. It's really just the technological advancement. Whether that needs to go through FDA approval again, I'm looking at like heat not burn technologies and those types of things as an example.
So I want to be a little careful because there were some active matters in front of my office recently, but I will just say, based on some public things that have happened recently, I think one good example of the partnership between FDA and FTC was in a pre-enforcement related action. So I think as folks know, Congress gave FDA authority over traditional tobacco products and then gave FDA authority to bring in the sort of more modern smokeless tobacco products and e-liquids and that sort of thing, which FDA exercised. And there's litigation ongoing about that I'm not going to talk about right now. But the point is that there were some products, if folks are familiar with liquid nicotine, I was not, I had to learn all of this. So liquid nicotine in open vaping systems can kind of come in these little vials. And if a kid drinks like half a teaspoon of it, they can die, it can be toxic. And so there were a number of things on the internet where products were being marketed that looked like kids' products. I think the most shocking one to the agency was if you've ever bought your kid apple juice, like the little apple juice boxes. There was one of these open vaping system things of liquid nicotine that looked almost identical to it. I held it in my hand. It smelled like apple juice. You put it near you. And so there was a real concern that there could be an accidental ingestion by a kid who would look at this and think it was a kid's product. So FTC and FDA brought a series of letters against the makers of these products that was brought under both FDA authority and FTC authority. And I think there was an announcement recently that those makers had withdrawn those products from the market. So I think that's one kind of very cogent example, particularly where, from a risk-based approach, there's an extraordinary potential risk of harm. There were already some reports of kids, looking at products that look like kids' candy and that sort of thing. So that's, I think, one place where you've already seen a partnership that seemingly from the public reports was effective in bringing that kind of product off the market.
I'll add that if you're interested, I would Google the FDA announcement about this action, because just looking at the pictures, the products look
I made them put the pictures
so
in the letters
similar.
because I'm a litigator.
Yeah.
Put the pattern, yeah,
It's
if you
really
look at the
quite
pictures,
incredible.
they're quite extraordinary. Yeah.
Next question over here.
So Patty, I missed the first part of your presentation. I was looking through your paper, but I guess this is going to make me sound very pro-regulatory, but it sounds like you were saying it's okay to not have the agency, fully invested in figuring out non-therapeutic uses are okay or not. And I guess I wondered if there's, I don't know, publicity risk. The agency's going to be associated with, Adderall or whatever, and then Adderall is going to turn out to cause cancer, but the agency didn't do anything about it, even as kids were using it. That seems like it would be, what that probably means is it'd be great for the FDA because they'd get tons of new regulatory authority, but that's going to be a real consequence for the agency, and so it strikes me that there's some risk in, any sort of even somewhat laissez-faire approach to non-therapeutic uses where there's that kind of risk.
I think that one way to frame Becky's earlier description of FDA sort of consciously taking a risk-based approach relates to that, to sort of criticism that gets heaped on the agency in the wake of public health disasters. I suppose a more cynical framing would be the one you had, which is good for FDA. They'll get more authority and resources. I think that the risk-based approach the agency takes for therapeutic uses is probably appropriate in the non-therapeutic use space as well. Not every it's reflected in the statute. Congress has carved out certain things from the drug and device definition, like dietary supplements are often marketed for things that sort of borderline on cognitive enhancement or are in fact cognitive enhancement, but FDA doesn't really have a gatekeeping role for those. So, I think the idea or part of the idea behind that scheme for dietary supplements is that they're relatively low risk products, at least when they're not tainted with active drug ingredients. So I don't necessarily think there's too much for the agency to worry about if it takes sort of a science-based, risk-based approach. I do think there's an intersection with the First Amendment issues that I think Dan mentioned, in part because often non-therapeutic uses are discovered or sought approval of after therapeutic uses. So as Dan mentioned, Botox was first approved. I can't remember what its first indication was, but it was...
Pretty sure it was an ophthalmologic use.
Yeah. And so, and then there's data developed showing that it eliminates wrinkles, and then the company seeks approval of that, I think probably in part because they want to market it for that huge, they want FDA's permission essentially to market it for that huge population of people that don't want their faces to become, or they want to eliminate wrinkles on their face. And so to the extent that some of the, maybe it was Becky, some of the First Amendment decisions that were mentioned lessen FDA's ability to prevent marketing for unapproved uses, FDA may just simply have less authority in this space.
We touched a couple times on the First Amendment rights of the companies for off-label uses, but a couple of times we've also referred to the liberty, I think the term was the liberty interest of the consumers themselves, especially those who face, life-threatening diseases. Just curious, is that sort of a term of art of the FDA, liberty interest? Is that just something,
No, it's my term.
Okay. Well, what did you mean by that when you use the term, the liberty interest?
Well, I do think, I don't think that nomenclature is used at the agency, but I
Okay.
do think conceptually, I think you put your finger on something very important, which is, FDA for some time has had pathways for compassionate use, to take your example, which is probably the most salient one. And I think Congress, in the recent Right to Try legislation, sort of underscored, this notion that individuals have perhaps the individual right to try, right, to get access to things and to accept risk.
Yeah.
Should have a bigger role, particularly in those very compelling cases where it would be hard to argue that they shouldn't be given that chance.
Aren't those very compelling, I was just thinking about this when you brought it up. Aren't those very compelling cases, the one where somebody faces, life-ending conditions, aren't those the one in which we think their judgment might be the most impaired? by risks? I mean, which way does this cut?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, most of these treatments are going to have the intermediary of a doctor, so-called
Yeah.
learned intermediary. So you have a doctor saying, you know what, given the circumstance, you have 4 months to live, you know, it's reasonable for you or your guardian to accept the potential unknowns here. The unknown that you could be cured, the unknown that you could die more quickly, you could have some kind of deleterious outcome. And so there's medical process around that anyway. I think for, you know, most companies that have, you know, drugs that are in study right now, there are often ways that patients can get into clinical trials. That may not be possible if you are remote, you know, if you're rural, if you can't leave your house, there may be circumstances where you can't. So there are already, among many companies, you know, a whole infrastructure that has built up around a program for how they're going to distribute things in a compassionate use way.
And this was the subject of, very briefly, a DC Circuit case, right? The DC Circuit held that there was a Fifth Amendment right, I think, to these drugs when somebody's facing an end-of-life choices. The en banc court, I think, then reversed the panel. But Dan, since you began with first principles, I'd be curious for when you hear this discussion, I mean, what do you make of all this?
Well, so I want to say something about the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act and structure function, but I'll answer your question. I mean, the argument for right to try is, you know, on its surface pretty compelling. The problem with it is the agency, for understandable reasons, wants to take into account before it approves a drug all of the relevant information. And to say to the agency, well, we're not going to tell you if the person who took it died, right, because they're outside the clinical trial, and you're not allowed to consider it, that's just not reality, right? So clinical trials are extremely artificial, but extremely well controlled. And the real problem with right to try is that unless and until the FDA literally says we're not even going to look at that information about what happened to that patient, although that's kind of an unreasonable thing to ask of the agency to do. Because let's say the clinical trial shows the product to be really safe, but everybody who took it under right to try outside the clinical trial died, that's going to influence the FDA's consideration about that drug. They're going to ask the question, why did these people die? So, I have a lot of sympathy for the liberty interest and for the patient and the impetus behind right to try. I'm just not sure that we've yet got to a super workable solution. The thing I wanted to say about the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act is it's a really good example of where the FDA's approach, one-size-fits-all approach, does not really always serve its or societal's interests. So why did we have the dietary supplement rule, the statute, which FDA hates? It's because FDA tried to regulate vitamins. That the only way they were able to regulate vitamins was as a drug. Well, guess what? If you regulate vitamins as a drug, you're banning vitamins. And so Senator Hatch and Senator Tarkin, and it was very much bipartisan, they all got together and they're like, we're not going to let the FDA basically ban vitamins. If the FDA had more flexibility, which it did, then classifying vitamins as a drug would not necessarily have led to a ban on vitamins. And the last thing I'll say so Bob Temple, who's the architect of the new drug approval process, a very iconic person at FDA, his definition of a structure function claim was, if it makes no sense and you can't understand it and it's totally useless, then it's a structure function claim.
We have 2 more questions right now here in the 4th row. We have 3 more questions. So they can pick you up on the camera. Conrad, do you want to bring them up? It's coming this way. And then the next question will be here, and then the final question will be Tom.
So I think arguably the biggest public health crisis of our time is the opioid crisis. And speaking of people dying, where I think we're at 130 people a day. We rarely have this much FDA horsepower kind of in one place. So I guess I'd like to ask you, what can we learn from this experience? How does it, this is arguably a drug which has clearly not performed as people anticipated. The pharmaceutical manufacturers of the drug are now being sued by many states' attorney generals. So would you what can we as a society, particularly in terms of the regulatory function of the FDA, learn from this experience?
But Patty, you
So
wanna go
I'll, I guess, offer one thought. Last year, I wrote a paper with a couple of co-authors, Erin Kesselheim at Harvard and Mimi Riley at UVA, where we looked at this question a little bit in terms of FDA's approval and withdrawal authority, and made the argument that the agency should take using sort of opioids as the classic example, but other drugs present this problem too, of a product that has significant public health risks and benefits that go beyond the individual user and go beyond the intended use of the product. If you are using an opioid recreationally, you're not using it as your doctor prescribed, and you're not using it as the manufacturer has intended it to be used in the way that Dan described. So our argument was that FDA could interpret its statute to take a broader perspective on what risks and benefits are for these kinds of products with widespread social or public health implications. So I think one step the agency could take is taking that wider lens on what it means to be a benefit of a product or what it means to be a risk of a product.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about any of the particular matters in front of me at the agency. I mean, I think one interesting observation is I understand that the opioids bill is about to be signed into law, and so I think that signifies some recognition that the historic powers may have been perhaps not at their zenith to sort of deal with such a vexing problem. I think one observation is just that historically, I think FDA took a fairly strong view that it didn't regulate the practice of medicine, which is of course a truism. But I think in response to the nature of this crisis, you've seen some very interesting actions from FDA in recent months, such as thinking about, well, could we change packaging? Could we change the way in which these products are distributed in a very practical, common sense way so that, you start out with people just having less pills. We're not telling physicians how to practice medicine, but kind of setting it up to succeed. And obviously, the agency's also been doing an enormous amount on making them less prone to abuse. Can you make pills that aren't crushable so they can't be as easily combined together for great impact? And I think the other piece of it that sometimes we don't hear as much about is just the recognition that serious, real pain, bone cancer pain, needs a real medical treatment. And so I do think part of this debate has also been, let's not overreact or react in a way that doesn't acknowledge real and true patient pain that needs an appropriate treatment.
So I want to pick up on that point. Be very clear, GSK markets no opioids. I've not been involved in any way, shape, or form in this debate or this issue. I think that the narrative driven by many that somehow the companies created this crisis, I think, is a vast oversimplification. I mean, there were Medicaid reimbursement issues, there were, fundamentally there are cultural issues and atomization issues and people not working issues and, also social welfare issues, all sorts of issues that have contributed to this crisis, which I agree is a crisis. I mean, I just read that I think more people are dying annually of opioids than are dying of AIDS. So I do not in any way, shape, or form diminish this. I don't think that the fix goes through FDA. FDA might play a role. I think Scott and Becky and many others have been trying to be very creative. Obviously, allowing naloxone and to be more, which is the sort of the cure, if you will, the treatment, to be broader, more available is obviously part of it. But that's not really the fundamental fix. I think the fundamental fix is much broader and much deeper. I was going to pick up just on Becky's point. It's not just cancer pain. So my mother-in-law, she's allowed me to say this, has had 2 failed back surgeries in her 50s. She's 85 years old right now, very happy. The only thing that keeps her having a quality of life are opioids. She is not a traditional addict. She doesn't engage in drug-seeking behavior. She doesn't up the dose. But she knows when she needs her pain pill. And again, for 30 years, it's enabled her to have a quality of life. And fortunately, we have a physician who's, willing to write that script, although it has to be written in hand, and we get a new one every month. And God forbid we should run out of pills, or she should by mistake take 1 or 2, because nobody's giving you additional prescriptions given the crackdown by the DEA, by the state authorities, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a MedMinder box, which is a really cool technology solution to this. But I am very concerned, in part because I also know what they are and are not teaching my son at NYU Medical School. They're basically teaching him never to prescribe opioids unless it's end-stage cancer. And I think that we do risk as is often the case in our society, an overreaction, again, not in any way, shape, or form diminishing how horrible the problem is, but we risk an overreaction that will harm a lot of patients. And I say that with my only stake in this is my mother-in-law.
Yeah,
So-
I was just going to add that I completely agree that, I mean, pain itself is also a true and real and widespread public health problem. And, you know, I think it is important to think about FDA's role, but there are so many stakeholders and, you know, payment structures for what kinds of pain management technologies exist, in, you know, incentives for developing new pain treatments. And, you know, there's all kinds of players here that, you know, it's a problem that took a long time to develop, and it's a huge problem, and, you know, it's going to take a long, concerted, coordinated effort among all of the stakeholders to address it.
Great. Now, I know I said we'd have 2 more questions. We're already about 5 minutes past time, and I think we ought to bring it to a close. You know, I said at a little while ago that it's not a coincidence we did the FinTech and FDA panels in the afternoon. We thought they both sort of had a lot of conceptual overlap. And by the same token, it's not a coincidence that we ended with this panel in part because, you know, it seemed to us that the FDA, more than any other issue, really does elevate and intensify these questions about the nature of government power to grant or deny permits and approvals, right? It's easy to talk about this in the abstract, and even for energy lawyers like me, it's one thing to talk about pipelines, but to really delve into it about both the power and the responsibilities of government and the liberty of people, to talk about all of that in this context is particularly challenging. And so for that reason, we're very grateful to both Rebecca and Dan for offering their insights from their experience in government, and most of all, we're very grateful to Patty for this great paper, and we hope that it's widely read. So thank you all very much, and this is the end of the conference. Thank you very much.